World regions in the global context, people, places, and environments. Middle East and North Africa, Part 1. We're going to start with learning outcomes. Describe the diversity of physical geography, environments in the Middle East and North Africa. We evaluate the importance of key resources such as oil and water. Summarize the diffusion of cultural and environmental practices such as religion and agriculture throughout the region, and explain the natural and historical factors that contribute to the diverse economies of the Middle East and North Africa, and how they vary from country to country, and how they vary to global and regional processes. So environmental society and sustainability. The environment of the Middle East and North Africa is environmentally diverse. And it's home to some of the earliest agricultural societies in the world. I'm sure most of you have heard of the Fertile Crescent. That is this region right here. And sometimes people extend it over and up through the Nile Valley. But in any case, it stretches along the Tigris-Euphrates River, up through Syria and down through the Mediterranean coast through Lebanon and Israel. It's historically significant rivers. So there are two main river systems, the Nile, which runs north out of Central Africa and up through Egypt, and the Tigris and Euphrates River that come here from basically the Anatolian Peninsula and flow south and end up dumping into the Persian Gulf. The dominant climate characteristic is aridity, which means it's largely a desert. Now, does that mean that it doesn't get any rain? No, it means that it's largely dry, but if you look at coastal regions, they can have quite heavy rain. And areas like where the Caspian Sea is over here, or the Black Sea, they also drive weather systems into this part. Now, one thing that does have an impact here are this mountain range along here, because we have what's called an orographic rainfall, which means that the rain falls on the wind. The wind is coming from the north here across the Black Sea, picking up moisture. When it hits those mountains, it dumps the rain. But this area right behind this mountain range is very arid. That's called the rain shadow. Now you have highland and coastal areas are much more moderate, which means they have a lot more rain. Some regions in through here have as much as 40 inches of rain. This area through here, where the red is, that's going to have less than 10 inches of rain. They typically have deficient soils, which means they don't hold a lot of nutrition in the soil, and they don't hold a lot of moisture in the soil. Climate and climate change. So climatic adaptation. So through things like regional architecture. So in other words, if you're in the Middle East, you're typically going to see buildings that have high ceilings. You're going to have buildings that have courtyards that are surrounded and private, that are shaded. And the reason for that is it creates space outside that can be cool, that can be used by the family, but is much cooler than staying inside a building where there's no flow of air. Activity patterns. And what we mean by that is people are going to do things at different times. During the morning when it's cooler and during the evening when it's cooler, there's going to be a lot more activity. In the midday, when it's extremely hot, very little activity. People will often take off time. If you were talking about Spain, we'd say a siesta. But in the Middle East, it's basically the same thing, as they take a couple hours off during the heat of the day to have lunch and to rest and stay out of the heat. The way people dress, so long gowns, thin clothes, light reflecting clothes so that it absorbs less heat. A very simple climatic adaptation. Climate change. Climate change is impacting the Middle East and North Africa, and what it's likely to do is change weather patterns with increased drying. And if that happens, you will have more conflict over water. You may have different, less water during certain times of the year, because if snowfall in the mountain drops off, then you're not going to have that rain or that water in the summer when normally would rely on snow melt. Carbon markets are where governments who are part of the Kyoto Protocol get credits for doing sustainably environmental changes, such as reducing carbon emissions or building systems that work better with a more sustainable manner. So, geological resources, risks, and water. The region is home to multiple mountain ranges, two major river systems. So the two major river systems are right here. You have the Nile River, which flows north and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. And you have the Tigris and Euphrates River. The Tigris is the more easterly, the Euphrates is the more westerly. And they flow south out of the Anatolian Peninsula here into merge together here in Iraq, and then flow into the Persian Gulf. And these two river systems have dominated this region for quite some time. And then you have the mountain ranges. You have the Atlas Mountains that run along the North African coast. You have the mountain range in the eastern southern Sahara Desert. And you have the large mountain range, which is pretty much most of the Anatolian Plateau, which is where Turkey is, and runs down into Iran, and through Iran, almost into Pakistan, and actually up into Afghanistan. So this whole region. And these mountain ranges are caused by the meeting of three plates here. You have the African plate on the west side, the Nubian plate, which is this small little piece that goes here and comes down along the Red Sea on the African side, and the Arabian plate, which is this part right in here, and the Arabian Peninsula, and the Eurasian plate, which is the large portion, is attached to Europe and Asia, actually Asia here, where the Caspian and Black Seas are in the north. Now the Arabian plate is moving east, which means it's moving in this direction, which causes the Zagros Mountains here in Iran. And it's one of the most tectonically active areas. So there's a lot of earthquakes. There are severe earthquakes. This region through here is known for its hilliness, its activity. And the other thing that the Arabian plate moving east is doing, it created this gap in here that became the Red Sea. And it flows down and then cuts into Africa. And you're actually seeing this area right here. You can just barely see it down here in the right-hand corner. This Somalia plate is moving away and will eventually cause a rift in East Africa, which will probably open up another area like the Red Sea, which will flood with seawater. But we're talking quite a ways down the road. A geological resource and risk, continued mountains and coastal environments. So you have the African, the Eurasian, and the Arabian plates colliding. You have tremendous earthquake activity. Turkey, Iran, Yemen, Morocco, lots of earthquakes. lots of issues. It's not uncommon to have severe earthquakes, and a lot of times the earthquakes are pretty devastating. And the reason for that is the type of construction. If you look here, you see mud bricks. And so there's not a lot of stability. And when you have a severe earthquake, you have a lot of damage. The region's most precious commodity is not oil, it's water. So you have the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates River. Tigris over here, Euphrates over here, and the Nile right here. These rivers flow now. The Tigris and the Euphrates flow from snowmelt up here in the mountains in Turkey and Iran, right through here. The Nile comes out of Africa, out of Central Africa, and flows north. These water systems throughout Saudi Arabia, throughout the Middle East, there's large areas, North Africa, where there are oases. And oasis is just simply where water is bubbling up from an underground stream. The area is crisscrossed underneath the surface with a lot of water systems, and they occasionally bubble to the surface and create oases, which are what caravans would travel from oasis to oasis, where they could water their animals, they could drink, they could bathe. There was fruits like dates and other fruits that would grow in the area around the oasis. The land typically tends to be fairly fertile. Now they've also developed a lot of agricultural practices, and one of these, what we call the Qanat, which is also known by the Falaj and the Fulgara. And these are gravity-fed systems. So you'll have the side of a hill, and you'll have wells dug down into a channel, and where water will feed into this channel, and then they can draw it up from the wells. And these are critical to agriculture in the area, and they tend to offer a fairly consistent amount of water that's always there. And then more recently, you're seeing the development of desalination plants. Saudi Arabia gets a large part of its water. Some areas like Qatar, 97% of its water is from desalination. About 50% of Saudi Arabia. As would be expected, the countries along this region, particularly along the Red Sea, they do have very efficient desalination plants and are some of the leaders in technology. The other big resource in the area is fossil fuels, which nobody's surprised about. Oil and natural gas. One of the things about them is that they're decreasing. There's less and less as you use it. There's a finite amount there. They've taken millions of years to get there. When it's gone, there's nothing else there. So what has fueled it is the invention of the internal combustion engine, and World War I established the petroleum as a foundational product of the industrial age. So in the early 19th or early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, you had the beginning of the internal combustion engine, started having automobiles. A lot of early automobiles were steam driven, some electric. They didn't have the battery technology for electric to really work. Steam wasn't very efficient, and petroleum was extremely cheap. It was a waste product. Gasoline in particular was a waste product that they were getting rid of because they were making kerosene for heating in homes. So early 1900s, they began, American and British companies began drilling in Iraq. And then in 1920s, in Iran in 1920s, in Iraq, and then Bahrain and Saudi Arabia in the 30s. In the 60s, early 60s, you saw this organization of oil exporting countries. It was that group of countries: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, Kuwait, Libya,